Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Ayo Akinwolere. There's a new wonderkid on the block, and his name is Florian Wirtz. Wirtz has established himself as the man to carry the creative responsibility for Bayer Leverkusen. But how does he measure up against the world's best in his position? And is there a danger in becoming over-reliant on one player to make things happen? In with us today, we have the Athletics Phil Hay, and we've also got Mark Carey as well. So the knockout phases of the European club competitions are in full swing this week. And speaking of Talismen, last night we saw Martin Ødegaard help fire Arsenal to a resounding 7-1 victory away at PSV. The captain contributed 2 goals and an assist to answer some of those who have criticised his performance of late. Phil, so if we're talking Talismen and Arsenal don't have Bukayo Saka right now, surely Ødegaard last night it is illustrating this very point. A player that, when in form, really helps the team tick.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Although I am slightly inclined to look at Arsenal in isolation when it comes to Ødegaard. And also, I'm not entirely sure that as impressive as he is, and I'm a big Ødegaard fan, that he's necessarily quite reached sort of talisman levels in the way that, say, someone like Mo Salah has, or other players that we'll discuss, Wirtz, who you mentioned. Arsenal's recruitment over the past couple of years has been very defensive, paid a lot of attention to defenders specifically, more holding midfielders than attacking options, and as everybody knows, kind of shot in the number 9 position. It's where a lot of their money's gone, and I think it's come over time to look like a mistake, or to have created a bit of an imbalance. Without any doubt, you have to factor injuries into that, and every time we talk about Arsenal, we come back to the number of players who are missing. But to look at the squad and to see how it stacks up at the moment, it does feel thinner when it comes to Arteta's attacking choices and attacking options. And I think that puts an enormous amount of pressure on somebody like Ødegaard and makes you feel I guess the impact of his absence more than you should if the squad was slightly deeper or slightly more stacked where it needs to be. But yeah, you are going to miss a player like him. And I think as much as I don't think that a talisman has to be an attacking player, an attacking asset, they are the ones that we tend to lean towards in these discussions. They are the ones that make it happen. Goals win games, ultimately, which is why things like the Ballon d'Or tend to go more often than not to attacking players. So yes, I think when you have somebody who does conduct the orchestra, if you want to put it like that, or is as influential as Ødegaard can be, you're going to miss him. But just to reiterate, I'm not totally convinced that you would have Ødegaard as talisman at this stage.
Okay.
I think it's interesting with Ødegaard as well because of the absence of Saka and how strong his season was last season. This season, because of Saka's absence, there's times when he comes and sits between the centre-backs to try and collect the ball as well. So in order for him to maybe have more of a talismanic role, he needs to almost be further forward to make sure he's repeatably in that position. But because of the attacking issues that Arsenal have, he's trying to do kind of everything at once. And of course, in order to be the most effective, you need to sort of stick to your strengths. So it's maybe a slight indication that he wants to be more of the talisman, to be all over the pitch at any one time. But maybe he needs to almost rein it in a little bit, which is quite strange to say.
Well, we'll hear from our Arsenal writer, Amy Lawrence, on whether Ødegaard indeed or Saka is Arsenal's talisman later on. But Mark, I mean, as you're talking, you recently tried to quantify the creative responsibility of footballers and came up with the talisman tax. Now, I found this article really, really interesting. It definitely a lot of people talking about it when you look at the comments. Now, we'll dive into some of the individuals a little later on. But firstly, tell us how you came up with this metric and how you quantify it.
Well, it has its foundation in theft, I suppose. As much
Says a lot about your mind, mate.
Yeah, which is quite normal for me, to be perfectly honest, from an ideas perspective. But it's taken from basketball as an idea, and it's based on the idea of usage rate, which is a well-established metric in basketball. I didn't realise that it's been established for near enough 50 years, which shows just how strong their sort of analytics side is, I suppose, in American sports. But essentially looks at the share of a team's possessions that a player uses while on the floor. So essentially looking at their shots, their free throws, their number of turnovers as a share of the team's total, and essentially looks to see which of those players are broadly the most ball dominant, how much they're contributing most to the outcomes of each possession. So in general, as a rule, you expect your best players and your best shooters to have the highest usage rate, and that's been the case certainly in basketball for a while. And I wanted to look at this in a football sense, and I essentially just rebranded the name and thought of it in a slightly different way. So it's this version that looks at the number of times that a player had the last action within their team's sequence of possession. So essentially an indication of them trying to make something happen with a high risk, a high reward action, like a take on, a progressive pass, a shot, whatever it may be, and essentially looking at which players are tasked with the biggest creative responsibility in their team, regardless of efficiency. And I looked at it just in terms of the attacking 2/3. So tried to focus on who are, if we were to refine it even more, who is the attacking talisman for their respective team.
Interesting. I was just thinking when he's saying that, Phil, and he's talking about basketball in particular, let's take that great Chicago Bulls team with Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman, and how actually, in order for the talisman then, the guy that takes all those high-risk shots and, creates something from nothing, Michael Jordan would be in that situation, how much the talisman also needs certain things to also work on the field so they're able to execute properly and be as efficient as they can be.
Yeah, I think this is the point. I mean, with people like Rodman, it was the rebounding, and I suppose we shouldn't go too deep into basketball here, but even latterly with the Bulls, people like Steve Kerr who could shoot three-pointers, it was so much about Jordan. But if you read any of the books about the Bulls or follow the Last Dance, the Netflix series, you'll find how influential people like Scottie Pippen and others were as well, and Phil Jackson, the coach. It's an entirely team package, as it tends to be in football. But I mean, I was just going to say as well, I don't think Mark should feel too guilty about the idea of theft, because I think historically the greatest works of art have always been stolen by people.
Stolen, right?
Yeah, it's just human nature. But we devoted a recent podcast to Neymar, and inevitably got on to talking about his stock in comparison to Messi and Ronaldo. And I was kind of making the point in that podcast that to be the best of the best, it's not just a matter of raw, hardcore ability. It also comes down to appetite and mentality. I guess the drive to be the best of the best indefinitely, to never feel like enough's enough, or that you're tired or fatigued by the constant strain of having to be aspirational. So I think the way I would categorise it is it's not just players who do exceptional things for the level that they're at, but it's them having the ability to repeat over and over again, so much more than flash in the pan exceptional performances like 1 in 4, 1 in 5. Like, these are the footballers who deliver consistently and deliver when it matters, and also, I think, deliver in a way that kind of makes you sit up. Like, the scenario that comes to mind for me always with this is Maradona at Napoli. Like, it's not that Napoli didn't have other quality players, but he brought an edge and an aura to them which made such a difference and got them to 2 Scudettos. And I think when push comes to shove, you would say that the crop of footballers who are like genuinely talismanic is genuinely tiny. And it seems to me to be as much an expression of mentality as it is purely about their talent. Having said that, and I'm really interested in Mark's view on this, does a talisman exist at any level? Can it exist at any level of football? Does it just have to be the elite, or is it more a case of who inspires a particular club? Because I kind of feel like it's the latter. Who brings the magic to the club that you follow? And also, I would say again, I don't think it needs to be an attacking player. I think Manuel Neuer at Bayern Munich, guys like Andrea Pirlo, play further forward, but Paolo Maldini, even English example, John Terry at Chelsea. It feels like it's about levels as much as anything else.
No, I agree. I think it's potentially more important as you go sort of down the levels, because there's probably a higher disparity between your best player and your worst player. So you want to make sure that you accentuate the strengths of the best player rather than at the very elite level. Pretty much everyone is that good that you can sort of spread it around a little bit more. So I think that it's, you could think everyone's got their own example of it at maybe Sunday League level, playing 11 aside with, your local team. I think that everyone knows that they try and get the ball to the best player as quickly and as best they can. It's essentially that, really. I think it's interesting what you say as well, Phil, about the almost like the game-changing ability of certain players. And I did something fairly recently on, and it's again probably based in theft when I think about it, but on Jude Bellingham, and talking about how he's a clutch player. Yeah. And this is again a bit of an Americanism, which was a bit controversial in the comments. But the idea that he steps up when things are tight. And I looked at the share of game state changing goals that he scored in La Liga and the Champions League since he joined. So going from a losing position to a drawing position, or a drawing position to a winning position. And of the goals that he scored for Real Madrid at least, he had the most game state changing goals. So he's the one who puffs his chest out when the chips are down and says, I'm going to be the one to go and get a goal. We saw it in the Euros in the last summer as well. He said, who else? He's the one who sort of steps up. So I think that's an element of talismanic behaviour as well. But to broadly answer your question, Phil, I think that sort of trait can be relevant at any level, and arguably more important the lower down you go.
Yeah, I'm interested when you're talking about that in something you also were looking at, expected threat, and other things that players can offer a team that gives them that expected threat. Can you just give me a bit more clarification on that?
Yeah, and I think this kind of broadens out to when we're saying it doesn't always have to be an attacking player as well, because expected threat, and I mentioned it before in terms of this talisman tax, and I mentioned it was regardless of efficiency, and that's quite important as well, because the talisman tax that I've termed doesn't look at the efficiency of the player's actions, it just gives an indication of their involvement within the actions. And often by looking at the list within the piece, you can see that they are also efficient with it, but it doesn't always have to be the case. So expected threat, and people who are familiar with analytics might see this as termed as possession value, on-ball value. They're essentially synonyms for the same thing that does look at the efficiency of measuring every player's action on the pitch. And I think rather than just looking at, sorry, let me just confirm that, is that it shows how much a player is contributing towards their overall, their team's overall chances of scoring a goal.
Okay.
So it allows you to quantify every action on the pitch, good, bad, or in between. So rather than just credit those who play the final pass for the assist and those who get the glory from the shots and the goals, you can actually measure potentially the value of a defensive midfielder who plays that line-breaking pass in order for the player to run on, take on a player, pass it for someone else to score. The player who has the assist will get some credit, the player who scores the goal will get some credit. But importantly, by this measure, you can actually give some valuable credit to those players who actually progress the ball further up the sequence chain, if you like. So it could be a centre-back who makes that crucial challenge to stop the counter-attack to then allow their team to go on and score themselves. Those sorts of things, by this measure, allows you to quantify that. And it has its blind spots, but it can be a really useful measure to show and give a bit more of a well-rounded view of a player's actions on the pitch.
Can that be affected, though, by, and I think sort of, just thinking actually, can that also be affected by whichever team you play in? So Declan Rice at West Ham, for instance, his role at West Ham, and you saw him driving forward, maybe getting the odd goal here or there as well, versus the position he's playing at Arsenal, where he's not scoring that many goals, but he carries the ball really well. Based on the system, certain players might not work in that same ideology if they go somewhere else with a different system.
Yeah, no, I think this is hugely important. I think this is where the recruitment analysts really earn their money, because you can look at something on a list, on a spreadsheet of who's maybe showing up with the best numbers, but it's almost trying to predict, and there's more complex models that do this now, and I won't get too technical. But,
and it's also with theft in the background.
But it sort of shows that you can see how scalable that player's skill set is, or you can predict how effective that player's skill set will be if they go into a new system. If it's the West Ham to Arsenal example, there's a different play style there to be like, okay, well, there's potentially a leap of faith there to be like, the skill set that we see in Declan Rice here, we can apply to Arsenal. But I suppose it links with the talisman tax as well. If a player's getting a lot of the ball and then they go to a team where they're in a bit more of an equitable, a sort of attacking sequence, shall we say, then they're going to, maybe their numbers might drop off, but it doesn't mean that they're any less effective when they do get the ball. They're just having to spread out their sort of attacking potency. So I think it is a really good point, and that's, as I say, where the recruitment analysts really earn their money to work out how well a player will go from one team to another, because they're only as good as the metrics within that team, within that system, and what the manager is asking them to do. But if they get a new manager asking them to do different things, and you can't always guarantee it's going to be the same.
We definitely need a calculation for expected new metrics per season, I think. Expected threat is a new one for me. But there is a point to be made about it, I think, which is between that and also the data that is used in basketball and the NBA to kind of identify a talisman. Are we kind of essentially saying that a talisman is basically an attacking asset? That is most likely to be what your talisman is, given the numbers that are being used.
So for this piece specifically, it was because I was looking at the attacking 2/3 of the pitch. But I think that you can absolutely still have a talisman who's a defender who creates that foundation to allow you to then operate in a certain way. I think that when I think of a talisman, and I've got to be careful not to double down too much on the term that I used here, but I think that to be a talisman, it's essentially a bit of a synonym for a leader, someone who is going to, as I mentioned before, puff their chest out. And that can be in any position at any one time. And you can also probably have multiple talismen, within the team at any one point as well. So for the purpose of this exercise within the piece, I kept it more towards the creative responsibility and the attacking side of things. But to your point, I think that you can absolutely have it as any player on the pitch, and you can define how much you're going to be that leader, depending on the team itself as well.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Just want to finish on this really before we move forward, is that, I'm just thinking about potential talismans of the past. We were speaking just before the pod, and our exec was talking about Cantona being he saw he was a talisman, or thought he was a talisman at Manchester United. And then you look at, if let's say a current Chelsea team, there was a Frank Lampard, now we've got Cole Palmer. You look at Liverpool, there was a Steven Gerrard, now you've got Mo Salah. That has evolved in a weird way. Like Salah's sense of leadership is slightly different. It's more about the end product really than trying to G that team up, whereas Gerrard was the guy grabbing them by the scruff of the neck going, we're going to finish this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll be interested to get Phil's thoughts on this as well, where I feel like now you maybe think of a talisman as one who just gets the numbers, and they're elite in terms. You think of Cole Palmer and Mo Salah, to your point, that they are just numbers machines as well. Whereas if I was to use your examples with the Lampard, a Gerrard, a Cantona, yes, they got good numbers as well. But it was more about the presence and all of the people around them and what they did to facilitate others. And we are probably we certainly are, otherwise I wouldn't be in a job. We're in an era of numbers. But we're in an era of numbers. Yeah. Look at, it's been done in the past where you actually then compare Cantona's numbers to the average, Premier League striker, and it's not remarkable, but there's no doubt that he was a talisman, and the presence that he had in the important moments as well, which again is something to add as an extra layer of importance, is different. So it's maybe evolved that way, but not, I think, more just because of the way that we sort of consume our football as much as anything.
I totally agree with that, and I think it's a sort of modern football thing, which again relates to the Ballon d'Or. It seems to me that the Ballon d'Or is influenced an awful lot about that, which is why you don't tend to see goalkeepers in particular, but defenders winning it either. It always gravitates towards the other end of the pitch. In some respects, I don't think it's really changed at all. I mean, your talisman is the centre of attention in the way that they've kind of always been. I don't think anyone today, even Messi, Ronaldo, would find themselves in more of a kind of intense, insane bubble than Maradona found himself in Naples. Like, people flock to these guys. They're really magnetic. They've got kind of sex appeal in some in a physical sense, but like in a footballing sense for real. And they're names and individuals that as a supporter you can invest in, because they're a really sound investment for your emotion. These guys do deliver all the time. Another point to make, I think, is that there's probably a difference between the perception on the outside of a club as to what makes a talisman, and the perception inside the dressing room of who is most seriously important and who makes the biggest difference. On the outside, like goals make headlines, goals, attacking threat tends to win individual awards like the Ballon d'Or. So we, I guess, automatically lean towards footballers of that ilk. But, say Real Madrid, where they've just been blessed with flair player after flair player for years and years and years. In the era of, when Modric was in his prime, and I know he's still playing, but Toni Kroos as well, how much of it was actually driven by them? And if you went into the dressing room, how many of Real's players would have said, look, these guys are key. You might have Ronaldo, you might latterly have Vinicius, you might have Mbappe and everything else, but there are others who are actually more important to us or are more critical to the way that we play. And I suspect you would get a contrast between what people on the outside would say and what people right in the thick of it think.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Phil, and I actually think a testament to the fact that Real Madrid have constantly renewed the contracts of those two players. Cruz recently obviously left. Modric is looking at another year potentially as well, because his importance is so...
Yeah, even last night when he came on against Atletico, it made a difference to the tempo of the game, I thought, and gave Real just a bit more control or a bit of concerted control at a period where they'd gone 2-1 up, and it really helped to close out the game and made sure they went into the second leg with an advantage. And he is getting on, but in patches he's still got it in a big way.
Yeah, I saw him score a banger the other week, actually. He's still got it, definitely. Yeah, let's move on. Could talk Modric all day. Now, we spoke about Florian Wirtz at the top. He and Bayer Leverkusen face Bayern Munich tonight in the Champions League round of 16. After helping Bayer Leverkusen to an historic title win last season, he's followed that up with another incredible campaign as well. He's contributed, listen to this, 15 goals and 13 assists across all competitions so far. So let's hear from our German football correspondent, Seb Stafford-Bloor, on what makes Wirtz so special and the inevitable transfer links to Bayern Munich.
Technically, clearly, he has everything you could ask for. Lovely passer of the ball. Wonderful to watch when he carries the ball forward too. He's such an elusive dribbler. He has this lovely change of direction, ability to drop his shoulder and keep a defender off balance, all of these things. But I think what you're really left with is kind of a bit more of an aesthetic appeal to Wirtz. He's incredible to watch. And he's quite old-fashioned in the way that he plays the game and in the way that he creates chances and floats and drifts. And he's not quite a traditional number 10, because I think that's more of a static player, historically at least. But he has those kind of maverick qualities, like a real maestro when he's on the ball. Anytime a German player in particular emerges in the Bundesliga, Bayern quickly becomes part of that conversation, and with good reason. I don't know that that's a move that's going to be imminent, though, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I suspect Wirtz will sign a new contract at Leverkusen, extending his contract by a further year, and that he'll stay there until the 2026 World Cup, because he's got a lot of momentum. He's growing really, really well, not just under Xabi Alonso, but with some of the other players there, with his place in the national team secure, and with him still being so young and him very much being a local boy. He grew up 40 kilometers from Leverkusen. His mum and dad are still local and are still able to come and watch every home game. I don't think, mixed with that World Cup ambition, that's something he's ready to quite give up, and he has plenty of time to move. So it's very, very hard to see that happening immediately.
Yeah, Florian Wirtz, man, he's been coming through so much in the last couple of years. And, the Athletic's Michael Cox said in a recent piece on Wirtz that European football hasn't witnessed a number 10 so intelligent and selfless with his movements since the rise of Mesut Ozil. Massive, massive praise there, Phil. And I know you probably don't watch the Bundesliga every week, but it's fair to say this is a player that's definitely making the headlines, and that name is crossing the pond quite well.
He's so pleasing on the eye. And he's one of those players who, any time Leverkusen show up on the schedule and I'm watching them on telly, you think to yourself, nice one, get to watch Wirtz. Used to feel like that with Kvaratskhelia at Napoli as well. Just the chance to watch him play, because it is silky smooth and it is great to observe. He's super, when Leverkusen are in possession, he's super clever with the ball at his feet, but he's super clever when he doesn't have it either. And what he does so well, Michael Cox's piece captured this so perfectly. It was on the recent draw between Bayern and Leverkusen, which Leverkusen totally dominated and should have won. And if they had, it would have made the Bundesliga a lot more interesting than it is at present. But he's really, really good at putting himself in position to receive the ball and then make the most of the possession that he gets. He spots gaps, he takes advantage of them, and it means that he can pick a pass, which he's absolutely fantastic at doing. Great at that, great at moving defences around and creating space for other players as well. Kind of makes defenders go where they don't want to go, and he really does make the Leverkusen system tick. Michael made the comparison to Mesut Ozil in his piece, which I thought was really astute. And somebody else in the comments mentioned Thomas Muller, just as as kind of the thinking man's or women's footballer. And Germany does have that knack, doesn't it, of producing kind of clever, intelligent players. And Wirtz is definitely one of those.
I mean, I definitely agree. I think that it sounds counterintuitive to say, or juxtaposing to say these two things at once, but he has such an appreciation to find space. And I watched back all of his goals this morning, and when he receives the ball, he's in yards of space at any one point. But he's also really comfortable when the pressure is on him as well. He's really, really comfortable in tight spaces. And of course, I looked at the numbers on this as well.
Of course you did.
I found some data from Skill Corner. It looked at midfielders, wide attackers and centre forwards in the Bundesliga. And Wirtz has received the most pressures per match of anyone within that group. So he's comfortable with players coming from all different directions, yet still he kind of wriggles out of that trouble as well. And I was lucky enough to see him live this season. I went to a Champions League game between Bayer Leverkusen and AC Milan, and I remember making the notes that I wasn't entirely sure where he was playing, because he was on the left wing, he was on the right wing, and he was just making sure that he was linking up and just sort of finding those triangles. And I think Seb made the point that you almost can't pin him down to a specific number 10 position, because he sort of floats laterally and vertically as well, and basically wherever the defenders or the midfielders are is exactly where he isn't. So he's so intelligent at just adapting his game and his positioning depending on where the opponent is, which sounds counterintuitive again when you're thinking of an attacking player, but he really considers where the space is and where the opposition are, and then as a consequence where he can go.
Yeah, Phil, where could you see him fitting in any European clubs? And I think we spoke about Wirtz before, and I think it was Seb that said, actually, if he does end up leaving Leverkusen, there's a high chance he's probably leaving with the Xabi Alonso, because Xabi Alonso knows he's got his lieutenant there, and wherever he goes, he knows he'll get product out of him.
Yeah, it's a great question, this, and Mark should probably follow on from what I'm about to say, just to correct or to give some observations on what I'm going to say about various formations. I mean, Bayern seem desperate to sign him. And while their system isn't the same as Leverkusen's tend to have these two number 10s in behind a 9, which seems to me to be totally tailor-made for Wirtz. He'd readjust and he'd slot in no problem at Bayern, and he'd instantly have more quality to feed from that area. But Manchester City feel like a very obvious fit. They need their next Kevin De Bruyne or something in that mould, and after 10 fabulous years, De Bruyne is pretty much done there. That is going to come to an end. I think the odd cynic out there will ask whether Guardiola would potentially system the flair out of Wirtz and a la Jack Grealish, but Guardiola does need, given how much possession City have and the way their games tend to shape up, Guardiola does need somebody who can unpick a lock against deep lines, and Wirtz has certainly got that talent. Just looking elsewhere in Europe, I don't feel like PSG's 4-3-3 is particularly made for him, and I'm not really sure they're paying that sort of fee anymore either. He's going to be super expensive when he does move eventually. And as it is at Real Madrid at the moment, I kind of feel the same, although, like you say, maybe it'll be Alonso who's in at Real Madrid or something like that when Wirtz decides to move. Barca, do they really need somebody in that kind of position? Lewandowski is, like 36 now, so at some point they're going to have to throw some big money up front, and that's probably going to have to happen somewhere pretty soon down the line. But Liverpool interests me as well. I mean, again, I don't think they're perfectly set up for Wirtz to just drop into that team overnight. But if Mo Salah is leaving in the summer, then there'd have to be a little bit of a rethink, you would imagine. And broadly, Salah leaves pretty big shoes to fill, and that's going to demand a move into the kind of elite section of the transfer market. So I'm not saying that Wirtz and Salah are in any way identical, because quite clearly they aren't. But Arne Slot will need exceptional attacking talent there.
Okay. Well, coming up next, we'll ask our club writers to name the talisman in the team they cover. Right, so we asked a selection of our club writers to tell us who their talisman is. Let's have a listen.
Yeah, so I think if you ask any United supporter who's the best player of the post-Ferguson era, I'd be amazed 99% didn't say Fernandes, and I'd probably argue that the other 1% haven't been paying enough attention, to be honest, right? It's 90 goals, 79 assists in 273 games in his United career so far, in a team that hasn't really lived up to expectations at any point since he joined. He's always been the one setting the standard, and that's what made him the default choice as captain 2 summers ago. If they didn't have his presence, his ability and his leadership at all, it kind of doesn't bear thinking just how much worse this could be.
Tottenham's talisman has to be Dejan Kulusevski for me. I think he's been their best player this season. I think he was one of the best players in the Premier League, certainly for the first half of the season, although he looked a little bit jaded in the last few months, perhaps understandably, because he has played every single game for Tottenham this season. On the rare occasions that Kulusevski's been on the bench, they've had to bring him on in the second half because they haven't been good enough to win the game without him.
It was obvious when he was in his best rhythm, and if anything, it's even clearer now that he's not, that Cole Palmer is Chelsea's talisman. He is the rising tide that lifts all boats in this young team. He's the best finisher, also the best passer, and overall, you would have to say the best decision maker in Enzo Maresca's squad, to the point where Chelsea's fortunes on any given day tend to hinge on whether he converts his chances or his teammates convert the ones that he creates for them. There is simply no one quite like him in the Premier League.
Speaking to you the morning after the 7-1 win in Eindhoven, in which for the first time in quite a long time Martin Ødegaard looked like Martin Ødegaard. But it is indicative of this season's struggles, both with injury and form subsequently, that if you were to ask that question of who is Arsenal's talisman, it really feels like Saka, because his levels of consistency ever since ever have been remarkable. And the way he's been missed over these past few months with his hamstring injury are pretty extreme.
Yeah, Bruno Fernandes, Kulusevski, Cole Palmer, Bukayo Saka, nominated by our club writers. The one that stuck out for me there was actually Bruno Fernandes, gents. Like, you know, I was reading the stat the other day, since his debut 5 years ago, only Mohamed Salah and Kevin De Bruyne have more Premier League assists than Bruno Fernandes. I mean, that's quite insane. But also when you look at this current crop of United players and this team and where they're at, almost more often than not, he seems to be the shining light, trying to drive this team forward. And you always look at him, it just looks exhausted by the end of the game. If he's not attacking, he's been asked to be part of the press. If he's not at the top end of the field, he's asked to carry. I mean, he's asked to do a lot. Take the penalties, take the free kicks, take the corners. I mean, this guy is working and puffing hard. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. I think that it's getting all of those numbers as well, in spite of the fact that they are sort of struggling at the moment and have been for quite some time. So but I think this links to the point I made at the very start about Ødegaard, where it's almost he's working so hard and trying to do everything all at once that it's well, he's getting the numbers clearly still, but it actually then becomes to the cost of the team overall, because he is, you know, pulling himself into positions that he maybe shouldn't be in, trying to be the one that is like getting the crowd going, but it maybe speaks to the Manchester United overall structure that he's maybe pulling himself out of shape, and then he's leaving space behind him, and then when the opposition counter-attack, he's not in the position that he should be in as well. So you can't blame him for trying, because he's got the ability on the ball, certainly, to perform those certain actions. But in the wider overall team structure, is he maybe putting his team at a slight disadvantage? But then it becomes cyclical again, because if he didn't do it in the first place, then they'd maybe be in an even worse position. So I don't know the answer to it, but it's there's no doubt that he's putting everything on the line, put it that way.
What do you reckon to that list, Phil?
Yeah, the only one that I would question really is Kulusevski, and not because I don't rate him and not because I don't think he's been very good. I think there's probably a little bit of, I don't know if recency bias is the right way to put it, but Son has not had a great season, but for a long time he's been so influential at Spurs, and I think he massively falls into that category, even though it feels like he is, you know, on the slide to a certain extent. Maybe at Old Trafford there would have been a flicker of time where you might have said Rashford, but it seems like a long time since that was part of the conversation. And Palmer at Chelsea, absolutely no doubt at all. And I think what Amy said there about Saka kind of feeds into my point about Ødegaard, that I think there are probably players who would class as bigger talismen or talismans, if we're using that phrase, than Ødegaard, which is no slight on Ødegaard, because as I said, I really, really do rate him, but I think Saka has a little bit more of that quality.
Okay, Mark, we left that Liverpool on purpose, and I know you're a Liverpool fan, but in your talisman tax piece, Trent Alexander-Arnold was much higher than Mo Salah, but also we can also think about Virgil van Dijk there. I mean, this is a team that you could arguably say has more than one talisman.
Yeah, which I think it speaks to their strength, in recent seasons, specifically this season. I think that Trent was maybe slightly higher because I won't get into the technicalities of it, but I did include, or I didn't take out set pieces there as well. So maybe it's because he has responsibility to take corners and free kicks to make things happen as well. But there's little doubt that Liverpool have got multiple threats and multiple players who have got the creative responsibility, which I think is crucial. The Virgil van Dijk thing, I'm probably going to answer a question that I'm going to create for myself here, but especially with everything that's going on with contract situations, etc., that Mo Salah has been incredible this season, do not get me wrong. But in terms of maybe the importance of a player to kind of hold the foundation of the rest of the team, I would argue that Virgil van Dijk is that player. He keeps the floor high, shall we say, whereas Salah sort of breaks through the ceiling and makes the ceiling high for Liverpool. And the way that I'd think of it is, if you were to take either of them out of the team, how would they get on? And Liverpool would have less attacking potency without Mohamed Salah in the team. That's obvious, but I still think they would find ways to create chances and score goals.
Salah was injured for a while. Do you remember a couple of seasons ago, and Liverpool found solutions to still get goals? I remember.
Exactly to my point. But then you think about Virgil van Dijk being taken out of the team. That was the 2020-21 season with his ACL injury. And granted, that's a few seasons ago now, but Liverpool's performances fell like a house of cards, and it was trying to sort of catch up with what had gone on, much in the same way that we've got Rodri with Manchester City this season. So I'd argue that, I don't want to get into the talisman tactic for this per se, but I think that the crucial cog in the wider system is probably Virgil van Dijk in this case than Mohamed Salah. But of course, please don't have any sound bites here.
They're coming for you. You know it. Put the poll now on socials. Let's see what they say. They'll come for you. Anyway, that's a different conversation. But real talk though, Phil. I mean, look, can we simplify it further? And actually what Mark said there was really interesting, is that it's the player that once they're out of that team, you really notice a massive difference. And in that, guys, perhaps Van Dijk is the real talisman in this team.
It's a pretty good way of putting it. Who is missed most, essentially. It doesn't totally capture what a talisman is about, I don't think, but it goes pretty close. Liverpool are a great case study with this, because you're automatically inclined to say Salah. If he leaves, that looks and feels like the biggest hole before you give it deeper thought. But if you take out Van Dijk, or you take out Alexander-Arnold, you lose him to Real Madrid, it'd be complacent to think that you just ride those departures, that you just move on and you find other people, because they are pivotal in their own ways. In my opinion, probably more replaceable than Salah. I do think that. I think Salah is at that really extreme level of ability, but they're only replaceable if the club are willing to throw what it costs at the market. And whoever does go from that batch, it feels like Alexander-Arnold definitely will. The other two, is so much harder to read, but it's a hell of a spine to replace.
What about the players at the bottom end of the table, though? One Brazilian attacker in particular has stood out in the Premier League, Matheus Cunha. He scored a stunning goal for Wolves against Bournemouth, which was also followed by a pretty bad case of head loss, and he was sent off for violent conduct. I mean, strange player, incredibly talented though, Mark, I've got to say. Now, Cunha ranked third highest in your talisman tax list, and I know of recent, I mean, he showed his worth for sure. A really key player for Wolves.
Yeah, hugely, and it makes you think how they'll get on without him, with the ban that he's undoubtedly going to have. And I think that Cunha was a really good example. I sort of focus on him quite a lot within the piece, because he is one of those that, like we said before, about if you take them out, how will the team do? But also with, I don't want to get into speculation too much, but potentially if he were to move on from Wolves because he's had such a fantastic season, whether or not his skill set is as scalable, sort of mentioned it before, because if all roads lead to Matheus Cunha from a shot perspective and a chance creation perspective, if he was to then play in a more of a equitable side where he was the creative responsibility was shared around more evenly, would he get the same numbers? The answer might be yes, because he's maybe around more elite players and you'll find more space, etc. But that was kind of the main crux of the piece, was that for those players who are maybe going from, well, in this case, a bottom half team to in the broadest sense, a top half team, looking at things like goals per 90, assists per 90 at a very, very basic level, how much is that to do with the fact that the player is themselves elite and overperforming? And how much is it because all roads lead to them and it is their responsibility to get a large chunk of their overall team's attacking output? So Cunha is undoubtedly a great player. You can tell that just from watching him. But I think that is an interesting thing if we were to think of the scalability of Cunha's skill set. Of course, he's played for an elite side before in Atletico Madrid, of course. But I do think that is a question worth posing if teams are going to maybe look to recruit him in the summer.
Yeah, interesting, Phil. All roads lead to that player. And I guess for Wolves, having him now banned for quite a few games, it's going to hurt a lot in them and where they're going this season. But also, I guess, for teams like Wolves who don't have a wealth of, I guess, creative players like Arsenal. I don't know if Ødegaard we've talked about, but, Thomas Partey can pick a good pass. Jorginho can pick a good pass. Mourinho, is a creative player. In essence, Wolves will definitely miss Cunha more than potentially Arsenal might miss someone like Ødegaard.
The stakes for this ban would be higher. If the teams coming up from the championship, or the teams who did come up from the championship, had more about them. It looks suspiciously like the bottom three are locked in, I think, and for that reason, Wolves might just get away with this one without it coming at too high a cost. The 5-point cushion is a decent one, and I do feel a little bit like losing Cunha for these games won't actually hurt them in the long run. Just to your other point, I don't think actually Cunha missing hurts Wolves more than, say, Saka missing hurts Arsenal. It's all. It seems to me to all be a matter of what it is that you're aiming for. I say only here, but Wolves only need to stay up, if you know what I mean. They only need to gather enough results that keep them above the bottom three, and a bottom three which is pretty weak this season. Arsenal are after the title. Arsenal still want the title. It doesn't look like they're going to win it. But that demands a whole lot more. It demands much higher levels. It demands that your best players are there and performing right the way through and at a super consistent level. So neither club can really afford to have footballers of that standard kicking their heels. And I don't think you can differentiate between how important the talisman is to a side at the bottom of the Premier League and how important it is to one at the top.
Yeah, as we've talked about the top end of the field, now we're obviously talking about Wolves. Any other talismanic players in the lower part of the Premier League that you're seeing? Delap's been mentioned in terms of Ipswich. Anyone else?
Yeah, Delap is a good one. Similarly, I think a lot of roads for Ipswich lead to Delap. So again, you think about the scalability of his skill set. He's going to be highly coveted in the summer, you should imagine. So I think it's another thing to consider with, with the goals that he's putting up and how much it is all leading to him. I think Tyler Dibbling at Southampton as well. I think he's got the freedom to be able to try and make something happen as well. And I sort of see it like the Jack Grealish effect a little bit. If he were to play at the, let's say, a traditional top six side, that whether or not he'd have to have a little bit more discipline, because I love watching him play, and it's obviously in a Southampton side who are struggling as well. So he maybe looks like more of a bright spark because, in relation to some of the play that they have. But I think he'd be maybe another one.
Just a slightly random one, Mark, and I don't know what you'd think to this, but what about Bowen at West Ham? Does he kind of make the cut just about?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think of the West Ham players, I can check notes. I think that it's only Lucas Paquetá, which makes sense from a creative standpoint, within this list, within the talisman tax. But I completely take your point from a sort of stepping up and making sure that you get a goal in the crucial moments. That's sort of more of the clutch player talisman. I'd say that he'd probably be that person, and especially from the fan base, it's like Bowen is that player, isn't he, that everyone thinks is, even when West Ham haven't been performing, he gets a bit of an easier ride because they know that he's the one who's puffing his chest out, to continue that phrase I've used all episode.
For sure. Honestly, gents, this has been such an enthralling conversation. Really appreciate you joining us. Mark, Phil, thank you so much for your time. And also, thank you guys for watching on YouTube as well. Don't forget to like the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And also leave us a comment. We love hearing from you as well. That is it for now. We'll see you very, very soon. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.